of physical and mental endurance. Remarkably, they survived and have lived to be more than 100 years old. Some of their stories have not been told for over 80 years and take us back to an event in British history now almost beyond living memory. They are the last survivors of the Great War, the veterans.
There was a big log of wood, and there was 3 soldiers sitting there with their hands on the top of the rifles. I got their eyes closed, and I thought, fancy sleeping through all this lot, you know. Anyway, the next day they were still there. A flash from a gun must have killed them outright in seconds. And nobody had moved them at all. They sat there.
I used to walk along the trench and sing, I want to go home, I want to go home. The cannons, they roar and they roar and they roar. I just don't want to go up the trenches anymore. Will you take me over the sea? Where those Germans, they cannot get me. It's so I don't want to die, I just want to go home.
By November 1916, the volunteers who formed the bulk of Britain's army had been on the Western Front for about a year. For those who had survived the 4-month Battle of the Somme, there followed a short period of relative calm. The men carried on with a host of jobs, often quite different from anything they had ever known in civilian life. Many worked with the 500,000 horses the army had requisitioned and which played a vital role in transporting the artillery. Gun carriages were pulled by teams of drivers. Bill Cotgrove, formerly a London docker, was a lead driver. He is now 102.
I was an officer's groom for 16 months, and I had 3 lovely horses I had. My own horse and two officers' mounts, and they used to have to be really cleaned. My horse, what I call him Elfie, he rolled in all the mud he could find, so I was there to wash him down. Yes, when he got loose, so I made sure he didn't get loose. But the funny thing, he used to try and undo his head collar. The rope he was tied, he always seemed nibbling away at that, and I used to make sure he was tied up, because if he got loose, he used to run for miles. He would.
Horses and drivers were extremely vulnerable to shelling behind the lines, which continued even in the quiet winter months of January and February 1917. Alfred Henn, a cabinet maker from Warwick, was also lead driver of a gun carriage. He is now 101.
I'd got a horse, I've still got its photo, and he'd only got one eye. I called him Nelson. His left eye had gone, and it wouldn't turn left. I sat on the horse one day. I was absolutely perished cold, you know, waiting there. And a shell come very, very near and burst about 6 feet from the ground. A huge ball of fire. And I thought, oh, if it had only come a bit closer, I could have warmed my hands on it. I remember that as plain as anything. I thought if it had come any closer, it would have blown me to pieces.
We were watering our horses at the time when the Germans started shelling. And of course, with the noise of the shells bursting and all that, of course, they knocked us out the way. Where they went, horses dived off out of it.
The most notorious spot, regularly bombarded by German guns, was known as Hellfire Corner, near Ypres. in Belgium.
I thought, oh, wonder what used to go on when you get to Hellfire Corner. I rushed all with the others right into the middle of this big circle, and they stood still. They would not move. They would not move. All the others had gone and left me stranded in the middle. I got off them, pulled them back, front, everywhere, and I thought, it's just about time now we'll get a salvo of shells at me, which I did. And I thought, this is about the end of it. And anyway, one of them jumped just behind us, and it shot them forward, and I happened to be hanging onto the reins, and they dragged me well into safety. So I can't grumble, can I?
In April 1917, the British launched an offensive to push back the German line that lay east of the French town of Arras. It began with an artillery bombardment. Working in the gun teams were many volunteers, like Fred Taylor, a printer in Holborn before the war. He is now 100.
Suddenly, whistle blew, and the sergeant shouts out, "Number 5 gun, prepare for action." And you turn the wheels and that sort of thing until the points, your gun's pointing in the right height and right width. And then suddenly it says, 2 rounds gunfire. Bang goes one, and you open the shell, put the bullet in, shut it, make sure it's on the right, woof, another one. And that's it. You've done your 2 shells, and you wait for any further instructions. Suddenly comes out, "Number 5 gun, excellent." It's right in the middle of them. "Oh, thank you, sir." So, you've done your bit.
Some volunteers were chosen to work in the elite tank corps. At Arras, tanks helped to protect the infantry and crush the German defences. But going into battle in these primitive machines was a harrowing experience. Archie Richards, a farmer in Cornwall before the war, served for 2 years as a gunner in the tanks.
You couldn't pick a way. You had to go over previous dead and dead that you'd killed. If they were if they fell in your way, you had to go over them. We never deviated the tanks for anything, only for action. I was a 6-man gunner. There was one on each side, see? And there was a lieutenant up front and the driver, 4 machine guns and 2 6-pounders. Well, you were cramped. You hardly had any room to move, you know what I mean? And the noise was deafening, really. You couldn't, you had to make motions. You couldn't speak to anybody and tell them what you wanted. No, you had to put up fingers, so see, we got used to all that. With our guns firing, the German guns firing, the machine guns going, and the noise of our engine, oh, shocking. Splinters from the machine gun, you know, used to come in, fly all around, cut you all over, you know, your face would be bleeding sometimes. When we got out of the tank, it was all freedom. Freedom of limb and legs, arms, freedom of breath, and freedom of mind. So we were new men in about 5 or 10 minutes.
The Great War was the first in which death could be delivered at long distance and in a totally depersonalized way. The civilian soldiers of the gun batteries rarely witnessed the results of their bombardments.
Well, it's a cleaner job than what it is sticking bayonets in people. Because you don't see what damage you've done, do you? The only feeling you can have, really, is that you just don't know how much damage. See? If we say there was 5 or 6 and they're all gone, well, you feel a bit guilty, I think, about killing 5 or 6. 1 for 1 doesn't sound too bad. But
To survive on the battlefield, the volunteers soon adopted the philosophy of kill or be killed.
All feelings of humanity leaves you when you're fighting. You say to yourself, well, it's either him or me. See? So I got to get him first. That's it. That's what you say. So you've got no feelings of humanity right then. Afterwards, yes, perhaps.
Following the tanks were the infantrymen, ready to take on the enemy at close quarters. One of them was George Littlefair, who by 1917 had become a seasoned soldier.
Aye, the Germans, as long as their arms up when we trench, they were all right, we wouldn't shoot. But if they had a rifle in their hands, we'd let go. It's either him or thou. And he was standing solid where thou was on the move. Aye, thou just pull the trigger and down he would go. You never forget it, never, and I haven't to this day. Just to think you shot a man, you know, and do nothing at you. That was how I used to always look at it. And then again he used to say, well, if I don't get him, he'll get me, and my life is worth a hell of a lot to me.
There was a new mood of longing for the war to end, captured in the hit of 1917, written by the young serviceman Ivan Novello, Keep the Home Fires Burning.
Let no tears add to their hardships as the soldiers pass along. And although your heart is breaking, make it sing this cheery song. Keep the home fires burning while your hearts are yearning. Though your lads are far away, they dream of home. There's a silver lining through.
As the latest crop of young volunteers marched off to war, there was a somber realization that many would never return.
Side out till the boys come home.
Fred Hodges, a grammar school boy from Northampton, joined up in July 1917. He is now 99.
I was marching in the street that day, and I suddenly saw my mother and father on the pavement. So as soon as I was free, I rushed up to them, and I put my arms around my mother, and she was crying, and she said, if you don't come back, I don't know what she was going to say, but I interrupted that and said, oh, I shall come back, don't worry about that, I shall come back. And it was such an emotional moment for me that I afraid I broke away from her and left her, still in that fearful state.
Many young volunteers felt compelled by public opinion to take up arms, but they had few illusions. Andrew Bowie, a trainee accountant from Edinburgh, would be sent to Passchendaele on the Western Front in the summer of 1917. He is now 101.
Accept it as the inevitable. You will wanted and you were being sent. It wasn't really my choice, really. It's not your choice to go there, but you accepted it. You had to do it. It was the old nonsense, king and country business. We didn't think we were heroes fighting for victory and all that sort of thing.
Since January 1916, the government had introduced conscription to provide the army with the extra men it badly needed. By 1917, around half of all new recruits were conscripts. One of them was Harry Patch, an 18-year-old plumber, now 100.
I didn't want to join, no, but it was a case of had to. I had no inclination to fight anybody. I mean, why should I go out and kill somebody I never knew? For what reason? There was no reason at all in it, in my way of thinking.
As the soldiers headed for the front, they were still singing, but the songs were becoming ever more cynical.
Oh, it's a lovely war. Who would be a soldier, eh? Oh, it's a shame to take the pay. As soon as the valley was gone, we kicked us as heavy as lead, but we never get up to the sergeant brings our breakfast up to bed. Oh, it's a lovely war. What do we want with eggs and ham, ripping up plum and apple jam? Home, pause, right turn, how could we lend the money we earn? Oh, it's a lovely war.
Throughout the war, frontline troops were constantly exposed to the elements. But in the unusually wet summer of 1917, they faced the hazard of mud, especially in low-lying areas around Ypres in Belgium. The soldiers' struggle to cope in these appalling conditions was often made worse by the rules and regulations enforced by army commanders.
The order was, coming from divisional headquarters, read, although you are in the front line, you must keep your boots clean and look tidy. You must look clean, and you Scottish soldiers must wash behind your knees. You see? So this was a ridiculous thing because we couldn't get enough water to drink.
We were always told that when we were going up or coming back, if a fellow fell into a shell hole which was filled with water, leave him there, because it was liquid mud. If you tried to get him out, you'd go in yourself, and that was it.
Working for weeks in waterlogged, muddy trenches, many soldiers lost all feeling in their feet. The condition was known as trench foot. But despite the danger that gangrene might set in, there was again little sympathy from the army authorities.
Well, it felt that there's irritation in the feet. And the slump came on the instep of my left foot mainly. The right foot wasn't so bad. Came up about the size of a golf ball. Just dirt collecting, pus. So the next day they came round and they had a look at it. The whole thing had burst open. And they said, oh, well, Jock, he says, that saved us a big job. So they passed on, and I beckoned to the corporal. I says, what do they mean by a big job? He looked at his list. Oh, your left leg was due for amputation below the knee.
To express their increasing disillusionment and to keep their spirits up, the men drew on the vast repertoire of music hall songs and monologues that were part of the fabric of Edwardian domestic life.
If it's a nice day and that sort of thing, and somebody's brought up a nice parcel or something like that, and you feel a bit happy about it, and then you think you burst into song. Or if you want to take the mickey out of somebody, you just sing a song which about more or less about them, or put their name in it, or something like that. Together with a friend of mine, while strolling up the west, we met a giddy pious band in blue and scarlet dress. They banged upon their tambourines and shouted to us lot, "We're marching off to glory." I said, "Marching off to what?" "You've got a long way to go, you've got a long way to go. It's no use banging your blooming drums and shouting, sinners, oh, won't you come?" I like to hear them say, "We're off to glory," though if they're only as far as Piccadilly, they got a long way to go.
Daily rum rations in the front-line trenches played their part in keeping the men warm and lifting morale.
That tot of rum in the morning, if you'd been standing out all night in a wet trench, you'd be very glad to have a big spoonful of strong rum down here. It was like central heating going right through your body. That's how I felt rum, because I was a teetotaler, really, beforehand, and I thought, well, this is good stuff. When this Corporal Baxter came along the trench, this big fellow, and you hear him in the next bay shouting, "When the sands of the desert grow cold." He couldn't sing, you know. I could sing a bit. He said, "When the sands of the desert grow..." You knew you were going to have a tot of rum.
After 2 years in the front line, Smiler Marshall had become renowned for his singing.
I used to walk along the trench and sing "It's a Long Way to Tipperary," "Who Were You With Last Night?" And they'd all have a sing-song, see what I mean? So at the finish, you'd got about 100 yards singing, because once I started, they'd keep on. Oh, if the sergeants pinch your arm, never mind. If the sergeants pinch your arm, just swearing blind. They're entitled to a tot, but they drink the blooming lot. If the sergeants pinch your arm, never mind.
Everybody swore. As a matter of course, it didn't mean anything. It was quite meaningless. The only word that was offensive was bastard. You mustn't say that. That would offend somebody. That's calling his mother something bad, you see. But all the other words were part of the patter that were used.
This part of the line we were on, they were fairly close to the Germans. They could shout to us. We'd hear them say, "Come and see here, Tommy, come and see here." And our fellows said, "Go to so-and-so, you know, so-and-so German. Oh, Tommy, come and see here." And then they'd say, "Deutschland über alles." And our fellow would shout, "Deutschland über assholes."
And if you talked too much, there was another thing which you wouldn't understand. A man talked too much. Can you imagine that being irritating or amusing? And somebody would say he was gas at Mons. That would create a laugh. Well, there was no gas at Mons. But he knew everything. He was too talkative.
By mid-1917, there seemed little prospect of any end to the miseries of life in the trenches. After 3 years of attack and counterattack, the countryside along the front line had become a mass of shell holes. Around the town of Ypres, the low-lying land had been turned into a sea of mud, strewn with bodies of the dead. This surreal world was the setting for the Battle of Passchendaele. Between July and November 1917, British troops were ordered to advance against the German defences of machine gun and artillery fire. There was little singing now.
Atmosphere of nervousness went through the whole company, really. They felt that will this be the last time? You've always had that in mind. It didn't matter how strong I think you were. You say, well, this might be the last time, but you wouldn't show it to be something to yourself.
Andrew Bowie of the Cameron Highlanders was involved in the attack on the 12th of October 1917. The aim was to capture a ridge in front of the village of Passchendaele, which by then was little more than a blot on the landscape. This was the view that faced him.
When it came to attack, the whole hell was let loose with the Germans. The shrapnel machine guns playing on us. We hadn't a chance. It was suicide, really. The mud was almost ankle deep. And if you dropped down and with your rifle, you'd find out your rifle was useless with mud. The whole situation was just a nightmare, because they were on the ridge, you see, and we were in the flat below, and they couldn't miss with their machine guns. But it all happened in a few minutes, though, the whole lot. It didn't seem as if it was half an hour even, till we were absolutely wiped out.
Andrew Bowie survived, but 1,800 of his fellow soldiers were killed or injured. The gain was just 200 yards of mud. After such futile attacks, the infantry rapidly lost what little faith they had left in the battle plans of their leaders.
It was just a bloody massacre, a hopeless mess. You see, when these people are back in planning these things, like divisional headquarters or whatever it was, they see it on a map. They don't see it in reality, the conditions. And that's what we were up against.
The war was in its fourth year as 1918 began. The men who came through the carnage of Passchendaele were battle-weary and in desperate need of rest. But while offensive action was suspended for the winter, sporadic shelling could happen at any time. All those in the front line had to cope with the ever-present threat of death.
You had to take every day as it comes. You don't know whether he was going to get killed or not. So I never used to worry about it. We used to get on with our job. Looking after our horses, put the guns in position, pull the guns out of position. I mean, what day did I know when I was going to get knocked out? I didn't know.
Well, you were windy, yes, you'd think, oh, I wonder where that's coming next, you know, and everybody'd be thinking the same, and you couldn't do anything about it, and that was it. There was the shelling had changed its pattern, and they used to send out shells instead of them coming over, woo, and then bang. They'd come over and say, woof, bang, like that. And we called them the carpet-slipping bastards. And it frightened the life out of these chaps who were only here one night, that they wouldn't even lay down to go to sleep. They said, oh, I don't know whether you stand it. I said, well, you get used to it. You lay down, you go to sleep, and all these things are going on all the time, and you can't run away from it. You might be running into it.
This assault on the nerves proved too much for some soldiers. In early 1918, shell shock cases officially numbered 28,000. The real figure was perhaps 3 times that, and in the worst cases, men suffered a complete physical and mental breakdown. Those less seriously affected had to carry on.
I was sheltering with the infantrymen, and I remember he was shelling them mercifully. Oh, they were dropping over it. Big crups, every size shell you could imagine, he was sending over. Makes you feel cringy, and it makes you feel bad in yourself. And every time one dropped, I clenched up like this. Well, I never did that before. So that shows I was shocked. And I couldn't believe it. That I thought my nerves would carry me, but no. It broke my nerve.
You were all the time, more or less, or at least I was, all the time more or less scared that it gets dark tonight, okay, everything may be quiet. Are you going to see the sun come up in the morning? And when the sun comes in the morning, wonder if I should see it set at night. And that was the feeling you had. At least it was a feeling that I had the whole of the time I was out there. You were living on borrowed time. It's what I'm doing now.
I used to play with the boys when we were out on rest. And then I used to get my harmonica and play Waltz and Matilda.
The turning point that would finally bring an end to the stalemate of trench warfare came in August 1918, when the British launched a series of attacks around the Somme. After having resisted a major German offensive in the spring, the British now broke through the enemy lines. The advance meant that the cavalry was on the move again. It was a relief for men like Smiler Marshall.
Well, we were getting out of shallows and trenches and barbed wire and rats. You see, well, that was lovely. I mean, there's a total difference when you knew there was no more shells were going to burst.
Oh, it was a treat. It was a treat to march. This was just a different war altogether. When you got into the country, you never felt in danger. You just marched. You just get on marching, the whole company together.
Another little drink.
We thought we were winning the war, all right. There was no doubt about that. Because we couldn't imagine the Germans going back. They didn't think they were losing the war.
Another little drink. Another little drink.
Here at the Riqueval Bridge in October 1918, the British celebrated the capture of the St. Quentin Canal. But many British soldiers were killed or maimed by enemy shell fire right up to the end of the war. The overall casualties in 1918 were higher than at any other time. One of the last to suffer, just 4 weeks before the close of hostilities, was Fred Taylor.
We were just walking up the street, just following on with what we thought a long way behind where any fighting was. And suddenly we heard a shell come over and we all ducked along this path, but it exploded the other side, the back of the house. And as we went to get up, so one exploded where we were. Now, I happened to be nearest to it. I was just 6 feet away. Twice I tried to get up, twice I fell down. So I crawled into the farmhouse and went to the best wall which I thought was the safest, and just rolled over on my back and looked down at my leg, and to my surprise I was looking at the sole of my foot. Somebody said there's some German prisoners coming down, so the commander said, well, let the German prisoners carry the stretcher. So when they got there, I was put on the stretcher and we were taken down to the first aid post. There I met a parson. He looked round and spotted me, and so he said, hello, Taylor, what are you doing here? So I said, so I got in the way of one, I think. And so we just laughed. So he said, well, don't worry. He said, I'll get in touch with your parents. I'll just say that you've been wounded and you'll be writing.
Meanwhile, the British Army marched onwards, liberating French and Belgian towns that had been under German occupation for 4 years. The war would soon be over. This was the moment the soldiers had been longing for.
When we had our pipe band with us, it was a great thing for them to hear a pipe band and the drums going, and when the drummers were going, you felt they were rattling the slates on the roof, and they were saying, "Vive l'Écosse, vive l'Écosse, live the Scots," you see.
And all the Belgians were vive les Anglais, all the little kids, vive les Anglais, vive les Anglais, the children, you see, and of course the women come out and you got the job on because they were throwing their arms around and kissing you.
And if you went into one of their houses, they'd give you offer the tasse de café. Voulez-vous avez une tasse de café? That was the first thing I asked you for, when you have a cup of coffee.
Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous.
During the last 100 days of the war, a quarter of the German army in the field was taken prisoner. Its resistance was finally collapsing.
They were all terrified when they saw us coming. Of course they were. And then, don't forget, they said, up goes the hands. See, if they've got a revolver or a machine gun or rifle or what, or grenades, throw them down and up goes the hands like that, would you? You see, as much as I'll go giving in. And there's hundreds done that. Hundreds. Kaput means finished. See? Kaput is done. Kaput, you've had it. You said they'd had it. That's the point. Yeah, I remember that. Kept putting the hands up. Kaput. Kaput.
While many British troops scented victory, those wounded in the final advance were taken to field hospitals behind the lines.
When they put me on the table to be operated on, I tried to raise myself a bit and have a look round, because the operations were going on everywhere, and they held me down with my shoulders, you see. And then somebody put their hand on my head and pushed my head down. So I hit the face. I mean, there's no reason to it. It's just something was stopping me, lifting me head up, so I hit them.
After his operation, Fred Taylor was prepared for the long journey home. Like many of the seriously wounded, he was suffering from post-operative shock. But before he would be allowed to board the ambulance train, there was a formality still to sort out.
I couldn't think of my name and address when I was waiting to get in onto the ambulance train. I just couldn't think to ask name and address, and I couldn't give it to them. So then eventually I thought that they nearly finished. There's just one or two more to be put on the train, and then it suddenly come to me. It was one of those ambulance trains where there's no seats. There are racks, and so when they lifted me up to the officials that were inside the train, one of them called out to the corporal in there, sergeant, whatever, any more? So they said, yes, it's just one. What is it? So he said, amputation. And that's the first I knew that it was off. So I put my head down and there it was, gone. So they just put me on the bottom deck. But there was no sensation that it was off. I wasn't in any pain. I hadn't been in any pain all along when I was wounded or anything. I just didn't feel any pain. So it was quite a shock to hear someone say, "You've got an amputation."
The armistice came at 11 o'clock on the 11th of November 1918. It was greeted with great celebrations by civilians throughout Britain. But many soldiers experienced mixed emotions. Smiler Marshall was angry. He wanted to drive the retreating enemy all the way back to Germany.
One of our officers, a major, somebody, never mind who, he come along, he says, you can pack up, he says, pack up your troubles. He says, the war is over. And I'll tell you, the soldiers, you never heard so much swearing in all your life. You see, they were angry. We were all angry because we'd been going 2 or 3 kilometres a day for the past fortnight. See? And he said it was an armistice. And of course, none of the troops stood up. Nobody liked it, I'll tell you.
Well, when we were told by this dispatch rider that the war was going to end at 11 a.m, my first thought was very selfish. I thought, so I'm going to live. You've got to be for months on the sign of my life belongs to my country. They can have it any time. You see, I can't stop it. I can't say I've had enough. I'm going home. Or can I have a fortnight off? But now I'm going to have a life.
250,000 British soldiers had lost a limb. For them, the future was very uncertain.
I felt I was a bit miserable to think that you'd gone through it right up until that particular time, 4 weeks ago. Still there you are. You had, I had my luck and that sort of thing. I mean, I wasn't blown to pieces. You just wonder, what the future holds. You can't think straight. So, just hope for the best.
Fred Taylor married in 1922. It was a happy marriage that was to last over 60 years. Three-quarters of a million British soldiers died in the Great War. the final death toll of men from all the nations that fought was 10 million. It is a memory that has haunted the survivors.
I hated the Kaiser Bill more than anybody. That's the people upstairs I hated. But I don't think I had any real hatred for the man in the field who's doing his job the same as I was.
Well, I called it a dastardly war, a war that should never have happened, really. That's my feelings about it. And I think it was my feelings then, but I didn't verse them. Troops are supposed to be patriotic, aren't they? So if you thought it, you didn't verse it.
I suppose, getting a little bit more up here, and I thought, why have we lost millions of men and the Germans and all other people that was in that war? Why have we done that and then settled it round the damn table? Why couldn't they do that at first and save all those lives?
Oh, God, no. Nobody fear. I reckon it was a ruddy shame. That should never have been. Oh, no, damn fear. No. I mean, all them young German soldiers killed and all our young boys killed.
I wouldn't volunteer again to do it. They'd have to call me up and do something, I don't know. We thought it was going to be a lovely little game, you know. But it wasn't. It was wicked. Wicked. Sacrifice of young lives for nothing.
So enormous was the loss of life, the Great War came to be known as the war to end all wars. The men who survived had withstood up to 4 years of extreme deprivation and terror. 80 years on, their stories have become the most eloquent possible account of the tragedy of war.